practices in public spaces 2021 to 2022. John Lee talks to Charmaine Childs. Strong Lady.
Well, tonight I'd like to introduce Charmaine Childs, who is a circus strong lady, has a national and international practice, and also a really diverse and interesting practice outside that particular outdoor arts practice. And I'm sure that the details of that will come out during our podcast. We had Charmaine, first of all, in June last year, when we ran a webinar about the changing practices of the pandemic. And Charmaine introduced a really interesting idea in relation to the relationship she had with, for example, the media of using, as many people were doing, blended delivery. So that's one thing I will be talking to her about. But first of all, welcome, Charmaine.
Hello, lovely to be here.
So what has happened since the pandemic or during the pandemic? Could you give us an overview of what it was like before, what happened during the pandemic, and some of the strands that come out of it?
This year marks 20 years of me being an international touring circus artist. And for most of that time, my practice looked like make a show and then tour it very heavily for a number of years, make a new show, tour it very heavily for a number of years. I'm not a prolific maker. I haven't, some people make a new work every season. I make something and then I love the process of crafting it over years and years and finding the details between every breath. In 2019, I had my biggest ever European tour. It was completely packed. It was really big, juicy festivals. And then COVID. And so when the pandemic hit, I was kind of, in a way, very luckily, already in the process of making a new work. And that new work I should have premiered an indoor version of it in April 2020. So the indoor version of the show, which was called Power, was almost finished. I had about a month left of working on it. And then it kind of went on the shelf while the world fell apart and I had a breakdown. And then it gave me something to sink my teeth into through the rest of that time of not being able to tour. And so I was able to go back and go deeper into the content, reimagined a lot of what I had been planning to do. And then also through that kind of 2020 into the beginning of 2021, made the outdoor version of that show, which is called Strong Enough. And part of the thing that was really interesting in the creating through the pandemic was that depending on different levels of lockdown, I was able to work sometimes socially distanced in a room with collaborators, but also figured out how to work on Zoom. And then figuring out how to work on Zoom meant that I was able to collaborate with people in Australia and in New York and and different parts of the country, but to be able to access anyone who could be on the internet, rather than just being reliant on who's within a drive from me. And so I feel like that even though that kind of through 2020 into early 21 was a very difficult time, it also, looking back on it, was it gave a huge change to my practice, because I've never taken a big pause like that in the whole time that I've been working. And to have that space around stuff and to not be dashing off on tour somewhere. And then the other thing that seeded because of that time was I've always been so busy touring that I've never kind of had the space to think about how can I have a deeper relationship with a community, because the relationship I was having was arrive, do a show, go to the next place, and being in one place, I was like, well, what happens? Because you can't, if you're doing one show for years and years, you can't just keep doing that one show in one place. And the shows Power and Strong Enough were really built around real people's stories that I've collected in interviews And I loved that process of kind of helping people to find and tell their stories. So then I, in my local area where I was living through that time, developed the project Stories of Strength that is now a huge part of my practice, which allows me space to really be for varying lengths of time in a community, because this project's really adaptable. So sometimes it can be 6 weeks of engagement with people. Sometimes it's just like here in Bridgewater, I'm coming in and doing 1 day now and then coming back for the festival. But that's been now as a new huge part of what I do. And so then 2021 came, the world opened up, and I had 2 new shows to tour and an engagement project. So last year was a wonderful re-emergence into the world of touring, and I didn't do any touring in Europe, just stayed in the UK. And again this year I decided not to tour in Europe. I feel like between Brexit and COVID, I was just like, I would rather just stay here for now. And so I am touring just in the UK, touring my 2 shows and my engagement project, and it feels really rich, actually.
Could you focus on something in particular? I have done some street theatre myself, and one of the key areas is the relationship with an audience. And this is really vital in the street arts performance. And when you lose that timing and that sense of the action and recall, it must have been really difficult to shift around that. Could you talk something about that relationship between what happened then and how it emerged later? Because it's a different kind of relationship, I would have thought.
Yeah. I think the way I've always worked before is very much based around audience interaction and audience participation. Most of the shows I've made in the past have had at least a small level of audience participation on stage. And if not on stage, very much like a conversational interaction with them. And the new work that I made, because I knew I was going to be playing it into a post-COVID world, I planned on having no audience participation. But I did then make sure that I made the show very conversational, because I still wanted to have that feeling of being very much here and now in this time and place with these specific people, especially as an antidote to how much we all are watching Netflix and all those things now, like to really capture the here and nowness of it. And I think I would have had a much harder time coming back to that audience relationship if I was trying to get people up on stage. But I feel like it was really quite comfortable, that stepping back into it. I had missed the audience relationship so much, and I think people had missed that relationship as well. And so being able to begin, especially those early shows, being able to begin with a very overt statement of, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do anything. And having planned that the audience historically I would have been very determined to make the audience all come in very close, very tight, sit very near each other. But with the new shows, I'm being very much more like, it's okay, watch from where you feel comfortable to watch from. Like all of that thing, just having to be a little bit more gentle, I think, with them, and a bit more like, engage with this how it works for you. I think we're all a bit more aware maybe of that people have different needs to each other, and that somebody might be ready to have a hug, but somebody else might still want you to stand 2 meters apart. It's like finding those things and being a bit gentle with them. But from the very first show back, I just burst with it, of that returning to connecting. I never realised till COVID how much I need to connect with strangers in my life.
Yes. And you tell a story in the webinar, which is very beautiful, about how somebody was crying in the audience. You said, "Are you all right?" And they said, "I'm just so happy you're back." It's just a powerful moment.
It was. And in that first summer, there were a lot of times where I got to be the first thing people had seen live, which was amazing privilege to be that first thing back. And and to see the reaction that had with people.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how you've used the digital, afterwards, because many people just went and translated digital onto their own practice, and then it was never as good as the first. But you've done it in another interesting way.
Yeah, for me, I know that because I've done enough TV spots with my Strong Lady act, I know that I am not a screen performer. I know that the timing for screen is so different than the timing for live performance. And I don't doubt that with the right director and coaching, I could learn that skill, but it's not a skill I have. So when there was that push for everyone to make digital work, I just wasn't interested for me. I just felt like there are people who will do that much better than me. And I was really lucky to have there were a few short film projects that other people were doing in collaboration with filmmakers, and I was able to be part of them, and so that was lovely. But I didn't want to translate my work to film.
Yeah.
But then in doing the Stories of Strength project, I've been able to create online galleries where you can hear people telling their own stories, and that felt like it was it was the way to share those stories. It wasn't that I was trying to do something digital. It was just that in the very first version of it, I collected the stories as audio because I wanted to use them in the show. And so I've just kept collecting them as audio, and then wanted to share that. And the easiest way to share that was creating an online gallery, which I think is it feels like a really natural use of digital for me.
Yeah. Could you go a bit more into the stories of strength?
Yeah.
And what got you there, and how you developed it? That would be really interesting.
So in the very beginnings of making Power and Strong Enough, I knew that I wanted to make something where people in the audience would feel seen by the stories that I was telling in the show. I want people to, the main point was for people watching the show to think of their own stories. And so originally it was just a research idea, actually. I just started at the end of Strong Lady shows in the 2018 and 2019 tours. I started collecting story. I just asked people at the end of my show, I was like, if anyone wants to come and share me a story, I'm collecting them for research for a show. And so I just started collecting these things, and then the stories were so powerful and so great that I was like, oh, this is the show. Actually, this isn't just research, this is what the show's going to be. And so then I kept collecting those, and there were two things that really stood out. And one was that everyone pretty much would say at the beginning, oh, I don't really have a story like that. And then the other thing was that once you just help people just a little bit and their story pours out, that at the end there was a shift in people. You could see it. They had just told a story to somebody about how strong and powerful they were, and you could see it change their posture and so then that led me to doing a bunch of research about. I was like, what is going on? And I found this research about the power of reframing our experiences as challenges that we overcame or learned from, rather than things that happened to us. Okay. And that when we tell stories of ourselves as someone who overcame or grew from an experience, rather than the victim of all this stuff that happened, it means that the next time a stressful thing happens, you're more likely to have what they call a challenge response, where you feel equipped to face what's happening, rather than what they call a threat response, where you feel under attack. And it makes the stress physically different in your body or something like that. It's quite amazing. Anyway, so that's what was going on. And then once I had more than enough stories for the show, I really missed collecting them, but had stopped. And then during the pandemic, when I was trying to think of what could I do in a local community where I'm not just doing a show, I was like, well, I loved collecting those stories. And so then I made this project. I worked with a brilliant guy called James from a CPP in Havering, and he helped me to kind of put it together. And I also worked a bit with an art therapist called Emma Mills, who works at Metal in Southend, and they kind of both guided me to make sure I was being safe emotionally and all those things. But I made a project where the essence of the project is that I collect audio recordings and photos of people telling a story about a time when they were strong. And then there's all different ways that can happen. And so sometimes it's a workshop where I do a whole storytelling workshop with people, and that's the story they work with. And I did that version one time with a mental health charity, and we did it over a 6-week period, and it was amazing, doing it weekly with these people and then seeing the transformation over the time. And one of the guys, anyway, it was very impactful for the people. It was really lovely. But then the main way I've been doing it is to go into a town and just go into a public place and ask people, just grab people off the street and ask them to tell me a story. And of course you get a lot of people say no, but the stories that you can just be stood in the middle of a shopping centre and the things that come out of people, and then capturing a photo straight afterwards of them, and I'm just taking it on my phone, I'm not a photographer or anything, but just capturing a picture of them when they've just told that story. People, you can see it, there's something in them that you capture then. It's amazing. And then the minimum kind of thing I do is then put that into an online gallery where people can listen to the person telling their story and see a picture of them. And then I write the transcript out as well. But then in a lot of places, we've been also doing it as a photo exhibition where we print prints that have the photo and the transcript of the story and a QR code that you can hear the story. And the best versions of that have been the ones where those pictures then aren't tucked away in a gallery that people have to choose to come and see, but they're in shop windows on the high street. So or similar, we're in a shopping centre, places where people who wouldn't think to go into an art gallery can encounter stories of people from their community and see their own self reflected in those stories as well. Because if you get enough of a wide variety of stories, there's bound to be one that people can relate with. And then the thing that's been the most wonderful about both the shows and that project is seeing how the impact is that people start telling their own stories to each other. And it's done exactly what I kind of dreamed it would do, and I'm so pleased. Yeah,
well, it's quite bold. It's really bold, isn't it? Because the possible ethical things of saying to somebody to tell us stories of strength can be quite difficult. And it's really, you're being really responsible by having an arts therapist behind you and all these different things. It's excellent. So there's this next level, really, isn't it? The people that hear them, and how do they respond to you? Do they say, "Can I do it?" Or do they listen and as you say, relate to the story? What's that next level of development? Have you found that out?
After shows, often people come up to me, especially street shows, because after a theatre show you've got to get in and pack up and everything. But after the outdoor shows, people often come and want to tell me their story. And if I've got the wherewithal about me at the time, I'll record it. But mostly I just listen to it, and they're amazing. But with the Stories of Strength exhibitions, I've often not been around, I'm often there doing a show for the launch of it, and then it stays and has its own life. But one of the feedbacks that I've had, there was one exhibition that was up in a shopping centre, and the people that had the CPP project who'd put it up said that they would often go and kind of watch people going across it, and they said that often they'd see people reading the stories and having a little cry, or reading the stories and then sitting and having a conversation with somebody else who was watching the story, that thing of it being, I think it is quite emotional for people to start to see themselves in a different way.
Did you take this story to the International Mind Festival, or was that another story?
It's this one.
And how was that? Because that's, I did the same. I went to the International Mime Festival back in a long time ago, and I was very tempted to do a new show for it rather than just doing a street show, which probably is what they wanted me to do because that's how they knew me. What's that transition into the theatrical space for yourself? How was that?
When I was making the two shows, I knew, because outdoor arts is my place, it's where my heart is, I knew I wanted to make an outdoor show, which was strong enough. But I felt like there was a version of this story to be made that could only exist in theatre, that had a lot, that needed the spaciousness and focus of a theatre space to be able to, like, there are moments in the theatre show where, like, there's one moment where I'm just lying on the floor breathing for a minute. If I did that outside, I'd lose my audience, you know? So I'm like, they are different shows, but that are doing the same thing. And I had to make the theatre one first, because I knew that if I made the street show version, what I'd end up doing for the theatre show version would be putting a street show on stage. And I was like, it needed to be a theatre show. So then I also worked with a theatre director, rather than, like, for the outdoor show, I worked with a circus director, but for the indoor show, I worked with a theatre director, because I was like, I need someone to rein me in. My instincts are so built for outdoors that I knew I would say more than needed to be said, for example, or, you know, it's like, and so it was very challenging, because I have so much faith in my instincts because they've worked for so many years. But I brought this theatre director, Emma Bernard, I brought her in very deliberately, but then it didn't make it easy to have those things where she was saying, don't say that. I'm like, but I want to. Like, oh. But we got there. And so because I made the theatre show first, I was able to go, I think, a lot deeper into things than if I'd gone the other way around. But then it made it so easy to make the outdoor show, because I'd already gone so far into the material. I was able to then just go, well, this bit would work outside, this bit would work outside, and, you know, pull it all together. So for the Mime Festival, I played Power, which was the show that was made for theatres, and it went really well.
Great. It must be quite difficult being a solo performer, having a director, having built a whole persona and all that structure, you know. It's a hard thing to give over.
Yeah, and when through that process, I realised that the way I work best is, rather than to have, I don't know that I would ever again step into a situation where I really have a director in a traditional director role, because I self-produce, I make the work myself, I begin with a very clear vision before that person's come in. And so in a lot of ways, you know, where the director traditionally is the one that holds the vision, I've already kind of created a lot of that. And so when I worked with Charlotte Mooney to make the outdoor show, we had a conversation at the beginning where I was like, I want to call you the director, but I want to negotiate what that means in this context. And what it meant was, I have a vision of what I'm trying to do. I need your help to make sure I'm doing that, which I think in theatre is more of a dramaturg role, potentially. But it was great. Like, I couldn't have made either show without someone on the outside. And I've always made shows self-directed as well as everything else. But it was great having those people on the outside. But the process of having worked with a very traditional director role taught me that's not how I work best.
Generally, outdoor arts, have you any sense if it's changed since the pandemic? I mean, for example, there's a lot more people involved in health and well-being now in relation to their work has changed, or their workshop practice has changed, or their outreach has changed. Have you any general feelings about or knowledge of that sense of how it's changed? It's early days yet.
It's early days, but I do think there was so much space for conversations and deeper thinking through that pause. And I think things like the fact that it coincided with the Black Lives Matter movement, and it coincided with a lot more open discussion about the trans community and gender non-binary and all of those things that came out, and so much more open discussion about mental health issues and accessibility for neurodivergent audiences, and there were all these conversations and space for them that I do think I can really see in the outdoor touring, that this kind of accessibility and inclusivity is much more, it feels much more of an authentic focus than it did before. It felt like before those things were a bit pasted on, you know, like where people would say, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between, you know, as opposed to now where it's just trying to use non-gendered language in general, you know, things like that, where I'm like, oh, there is, and the same with, you know, all of the access stuff for neurodivergent audiences and things like it's, I feel like, especially for outdoor arts, because we're going out into the public place where there is every kind of people, I think the new practices that have come in for accessibility like that, they don't just benefit people who are on the autistic spectrum or anything. I think they benefit all sorts of audiences because it's just creating a bit more, it's opening the door a bit more to everybody, I think.
Yeah, there's a sense in which the public space, you know, has always had the opportunity to become a public forum. Yeah, and that may be something which will become more interesting, I think, because, you know, people have changed because of this pandemic and what they care for and another life. I mean, a number of people have retired because they're fed up with working and have another life, etc., you know, if they can. Not always an advantage to everybody, but yeah, that's really interesting. Yes, I've always watched your show, Charmaine, and I always enjoyed the relationship you have with men in particular, who you've treated really kindly in a way that I've seen performers go, right, we're going to really set them up. What about this relationship? Can you tell us something more about it? Because it's very generous the way you work.
Oh, thank you. It's yeah, for me it's always been really important that my show is for people, not just for women or just for men. And because I think Mary Beard in her book Women in Power put it very succinctly, where she said that in public spaces, women only historically tend to have a voice if it is about women's issues or children's issues, and men tend to speak for everyone. And so it's really easy as a woman for your work to be pigeonholed to be for women. And especially as someone who's doing a strong lady show, people think it is a strong lady show that is about feminism and is for women. And of course, there is definitely a feminist subtext to all my work. But more importantly, my show is for humans. And so when I've had men as volunteers, I am trying to use my role in the show to showcase the strength and power of women and the ability for a woman to take up space and be strong, obviously. But I also wanted to use the men on stage to showcase how supportive and kind and the ways that men can amplify the voices of women, because I couldn't do the show without them. And so I've always kind of made a point to try wherever possible to, you know, and also to show in my very early work, I was very flirty with the men because it just seemed like the natural thing to do. And then, but I made a very clear decision at some point to be like, oh, it doesn't have to be that way. And so I also wanted to show an equal and platonic relationship between men and women on stage and bring that forward. And then when I was making these new shows, I made certain, a lot of people assumed that they would be stories of strong women that I would be telling. And I decided that I wanted to tell stories of humans and how they feel strong. And sometimes it'll be a man's story that a woman will most closely feel related to. And sometimes it'll be a woman's story that speaks to one of the men in the audience. And it doesn't have to be, you know, it's about humans. And I think for me, it's really important that we find more and more the things that we all have in common, rather than this thing of putting ourselves into little identity boxes and separating.
This is a difficult thing to do right now with so much going on in the street and men and women, etc. This is really important work and quite hard work. I would have thought you have to be very sensitive to this balance, this relationship, you know.
Yeah, and it takes out some very easy laughs, you know. There's a whole lot of laughs that are so easy to get that you just have to choose not to take, because you're like, that's gonna, you know, like that normalizes this thing and that amplifies that thing, and you're like, oh.
It's like an alternative comedy of now, really, in that sense of not wanting to go back to the terrible old jokes. Yeah. So you're evolving. You speak a lot in your show.
Yes.
So you're evolving. Are you evolving your text all the time? Because I know that there's a big habit, or there used to be a big habit in the street of always hanging on to things that work, and they lasted for some like 10 years sometimes, and it's hard not to use them because you're always watching that positive response from an audience.
Yeah, I think this, if I was to bring back my Strong Lady show, my old show that I did before the pandemic, I would imagine I would rework the script. And that one is a bit more improvised, so it did always kind of evolve. But the show Strong Enough that I'm doing now outside is quite scripted, like all the stories, like there's a little bit of play with, like, I will change slightly the way I say something or the rhythm depending on the people that are there, and if something happens I'll have a little tangent to acknowledge the thing that's happening. But it's much more scripted because it is a storytelling show, and all the words have been quite carefully crafted to tell the story in as few words as possible. So I don't tend to change it that much so far. And I'm resisting the urge to just constantly add words.
Yeah. And I suppose that depends upon the audience response. You're very tempted sometimes to go off on a little tangent, you know, in the same sort of way that Eddie Izzard used to, for example, make it up as he was going along. Or maybe he did, or maybe he didn't. It's
also, that's the thing, to try and keep finding the way that feels like you're thinking of this line for the first time, and for me that tends to come a lot down to, it's the rhythm that I'm finding each time. So even though I'm sticking to basically the same words, I don't have the same delivery every time, because if I start to fall into a pattern of delivery, that sounds like da 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 da, here's the end of that bit, you know. And whereas if I make sure that I keep the rhythm fresh and try and play it off what I'm getting from the audience, so sometimes I'll get to a bit of story and that bit will get really, really fast because I can see because of something that I'm getting from the audience. And then sometimes that story will be just told in a very like off the cuff kind of way, or, you know, but by keeping the rhythm variable, it feels like I'm just having a conversation with the audience. And as soon as it starts to feel stale, it's when I've fallen into a pattern.
Yeah. It keeps it alive for the audience, it keeps it alive for yourself.
Yeah.
Especially if you're doing the same material quite similarly for long periods of time. Yeah. What's next?
It's a really good question. I've got one project that is like the soon next thing, which is just another evolution of this same work that I'm doing now, which is to push it into rural touring venues. And I've had a great response from rural touring networks, but then realised that I've done a couple of venues and realised that actually that I'm taking the theatre show to the rural touring venues, and there's a couple of things that make it not quite a perfect fit, where like it's not very flexible staging, and so a lot of those venues it's hard to fit the show into it, or, you know, like things like that I want to rework the show to make one that has a few more big spectacle moments and has a few more whatever, just to make it work for that environment. So that's like the first little thing is I'm going to do a little, it's in a similar way to I had different but from the same heart shows for theatre and for outdoor. I realised that rural touring is its own beast. It needs its own version. So that's nice. That's a new thing. But I turned 43 in a couple of days, and one of the things that I'm noticing is that I've got an itch to kind of start to figure out what is the next big thing. Like where you know, for the last 20 years I've had a very similar rhythm with my work, which is very touring heavy. And I wonder if 10 years from now, if this is what I still want to be doing, and or if it's that I want to be creating larger scale shows as a producer and director, and I think what I'm leaning at the moment, the thing that like the daydream is that I've been a self-producing artist the whole time, and in the early part of my career before I left Australia, I used to produce a festival, and so I'm thinking I'm going to maybe start to shift more into producing and curating and that kind of thing. Maybe try and run a festival, maybe try and work in a CPP, or I don't know what it is yet, but I'm thinking I might have a crossfade that starts sometime soon.
I think you'd be also a very good dramaturg.
Oh.
Because of the way you talk about the work and how you integrate the bigger picture into particular performances. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure where dramaturgs are in this country in particular or elsewhere, because they're a funny breed that people go, you don't need a dramaturg, you've got a director, you know.
Yeah, and I'm not even quite sure what a dramaturg is.
Yes, what is a dramaturg? It's one of those continental things, you know. Goodness me. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Charmaine, thank you so much. Lovely talking to you.
You as well.
Funded by Higher Education Innovation Fund. Produced by Institute of Place, Centre of Performance Practice Research, and Fuse Performance. Recorded and edited by Mark Palmer.